Hi there, my name's Becky Westbury. I'm a community midwife team leader from Hywel University Health Board.
Hi, I'm Alys Einion-Waller and I'm an Associate Professor of Midwifery from Swansea University.
So we're going to be talking to you today about a study that I undertook for my master's dissertation. And this study was an exploration of midwives' attitudes towards caring for women who choose to birth outside of guidelines. So this study, as I just said, came about as part of my master's dissertation, and it was really stemmed from my own experiences of caring for women choosing to birth outside of guidelines. So through my role as a community midwife team leader, I've supported women making birth plans, and some of these women choose to birth outside of guidelines. I supported a couple of women last year and in 2018 who chose to have home births following a previous caesarean section, so a home VBAC. And it was really through supporting these women that I felt this study had a place. I felt I really wanted to look at how midwives felt supporting women birthing outside of guidelines, following, seeing how positive these birth experiences can be for women. So this Instagram post on the left here, I've shared it with this woman's consent. This woman had a home VBAC of her third baby, and she's captioned it below, "This was the best day of my life." She felt really well supported, she felt really strong. And as I said, seeing how women have felt following birthing outside of guidelines made me want to explore how we could better support them, so how midwives feel about supporting women birthing outside of guidelines. So the aims and objectives of the study: I chose to undertake a mixed method study, so to obtain both qualitative and quantitative data. I wanted to look at what midwives perceive to be barriers in providing care for women birthing outside of guidelines, with an aim to then brainstorm how these barriers could be overcome to improve care and outcomes for women and families. And I also wanted to ascertain how comfortable midwives felt when caring for women birthing outside of guidelines. So the methodology of the study: I designed a Qualtrics survey with support from my academic supervisor from Swansea University, and I shared the survey link on social media. So the survey link went live on the 1st of January 2020 and was live for 14 days. So the survey was aimed at midwives who were working in the UK. So in the 14-day data collection period, I obtained 707 responses to the survey, and this was shared on social media alone, so just through Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And the data were then analysed using NVivo and SPSS. We also had some independent researcher support to analyse the quantitative data using SPSS.
Thanks, Becky. So I'm going to talk about the quantitative results. And as Becky said, we were lucky to get support from a quantitative researcher at the university who ran the tests. Initially, there was no plan to use any inferential statistics. We were going to just use descriptive statistics. But because the sample size was so large, we were advised that we could carry out some simple chi-square tests to look at some of the relationships between some of the questions and the responses. And so we've presented these here. The first result is the relationship between the levels of comfort that midwives feel in caring for women who've chosen to birth outside guidelines and how long they've been qualified. And as you can see from this table, there is a statistically significant relationship between these two questions, and that this varies depending on the length of qualification. So you can see that it seems to be those who were qualified between 4 and 6 years were more comfortable, as well as those who've been qualified between 16 and 32 years. But other years of qualification were different. So that was our first interesting finding. The next slide, the next table looks at the relationship between the person's role, their current role in practice, and how comfortable they would be in caring for women who birth outside guidelines. And you can see again, we found a statistically significant relationship depending on the role of the person. And it seemed there was greater comfort in those who were hospital midwives and greater comfort also for those who were senior midwives. So this is an interesting relationship, and we will be unpicking it a lot more when we publish these data. The next relationship that was statistically significant was that between midwives feeling supported by leaders and their levels of comfort in caring for women who birth outside guidelines. And again, we see a relationship there. And this seems to be directly related to the amount of support. But what you can see is people who were moderately comfortable were more strongly linked to support from leaders. The next relationship that showed a statistically significant relationship was between the desire for further training and how comfortable midwives felt caring for women who birth outside guidelines. And again, there was a statistically significant relationship. So these two factors appear to be related. We also found a relationship between the role of the midwife and their levels of support, leader support, and the role of the midwife and the impact of women declining aspects of care. We also found a significant relationship between the length of time being qualified and wanting more training and guidance, and role and wanting more training and guidance. We also found a really interesting relationship that those who had a desire for more training and guidance, there was a relationship between this and feeling uneasy with caring for with reading a birth plan where women choose to birth outside guidelines. So there are things to be learned from that too. We found no relationship in two of our chi-square tests. So this was between years of qualification and declining aspects of care and leader support and years of qualification. So there were no statistical relationship between these two.
Okay, thank you, Alys. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the qualitative themes. So the way that the qualitative data were analysed is that during my master's, I used NVivo to come up with initial themes, and then Alys did a second level thematic analysis and went over these themes. These were the final themes then that we have come up with from the data. So the first one is as long as, or a fear of implications. So 205 midwives in their free text responses made reference to fear of implications and also used the phrase as long as when referring to their levels of comfort caring for women birthing outside of guidelines. So this really suggested that the way in which women felt, midwives felt, caring for women was dependent on other factors. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in the next slide. The next theme was challenging women and negative relationships. So some midwives did refer to a perception or experiences that some women choosing to birth outside of guidelines could be slightly challenging to care for. They also made reference then to negative relationships, whether these were with the women and families themselves, with fellow midwives, or with obstetric colleagues. 59 references were made in the free text responses to coercion, which was quite a shocking finding, we both thought. And this was, where women are sadly being coerced or attempted to be coerced by midwives or obstetricians into making different choices, so following guidance. And midwives shared some quite shocking free text responses in relation to that theme. The next theme then was organisational resources and time. So we were both quite surprised that only 44 responses made reference to these. So organisational resources, time, things like guidance, equipment, actually having time to make plans. These didn't crop up as often as we thought they would in the findings. So that was definitely quite interesting. And then the last theme was women-centred care. So as we would expect with women, any woman making a birth plan, women-centred care is going to be really central to the midwifery care being provided. So that was our final theme.
Thanks, Becky. I'm just going to say a few more words about the qualitative analysis. One of the things that was really striking was the way the voices of midwives came through in the qualitative data. And they particularly came through in reference to the culture in which midwives work. So with the as long as and the fear of implications, it was a very much a fear of litigation, a blame culture, a sense of professional vulnerability and professional accountability. And I found that quite poignant in some of the responses. When it came to the negative relationships, this linked to this idea that they would be seen by others as not acting in the best manner. But when we see so many references to woman-centered care, you could really appreciate the way that midwives were falling back on their core midwifery values and saying, well, if this is a woman's choice, then this is what we have to provide. There was just so many qualifications to that, as long as she is well informed, as long as she understands, you know, the implications for her. It did seem that midwives were trying to practice in a woman-centered way, but that the culture and their own fears were perhaps affecting that.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to share now a couple of the direct quotes that were pulled from the survey itself. So one midwife responded that they have no issues if the woman has made an informed choice. I have limitations in practice which she would need to take into consideration. She has to take some accountability for her decisions. So this really shows some of the quotes that came under the as long as theme. So midwives feeling that the way they felt caring for women birthing outside of guidelines was dependent on other factors. The next quote then, often with the women themselves, the women themselves are often defensive, expecting negative communication. This just shows an example of some of the responses that came under the negative relationships challenging women theme. Staff room slandering, that does she not love her baby attitude. Doctors treat these women like naughty kids. As Alys made reference to previously, this culture perhaps of you know, midwives wanting to provide woman-centered care, but almost having these obstacles to overcome, you know, such as negative feelings and views from colleagues. This just shows you know, evidence of this. Fear of being labelled as a reckless midwife. Again, this real fear of litigation, fear of blame, and this just getting in the way of midwives providing the woman-centered care that they want to provide. Consultants putting pressure on women to conform, doctors telling women they are being selfish and their baby will die. You know, really shocking quotes like this, showing how coercion is sadly coming into play when midwives are supporting women choosing to birth outside of guidelines. So just quickly then, a few limitations of the study. The questionnaire that I designed as part of my master's wasn't validated or piloted. Unfortunately, due to the constraints of the module I was doing, there wasn't time to pilot it. However, we still had a very good response rate, and we've got some really valuable data from the survey. The sample was recruited online. It was solely online, as I said before, just on social media. Therefore, some midwives who aren't on social media won't have been able to access the survey. So that is a limitation. Also then, we did have a much larger number of responses than anticipated. So it has meant, as Alys said, we've had to change how we are analysing the data. So we've just kind of acknowledged this here. So implications for future practice and research. It was really clear how midwives' attitudes were dependent on other factors. So this is something that could perhaps be looked at in future, but it's really important to acknowledge that midwives almost have this conflict in wanting to support women, but then being mindful or guided by other factors. The culture amongst midwives and obstetricians, again, midwives and obstetricians, as we know, work collaboratively to provide care for women and families, but there was perhaps this underlying this cultural sense of midwives wanting to provide the women-centered care, and then sometimes finding obstetricians is a little bit of a barrier in that. And then this balance between midwives wanting to provide the holistic, woman-centered, matricentric care, and then also feeling that they are needing to be medically responsible. So feeling almost restricted by their need to follow guidelines and to be mindful of litigation and blame and fear, and how these two were really kind of conflicting in midwives' opinions towards how they felt caring for women birthing outside of guidelines. So thank you very much for listening. Our contact details are listed below if anybody has any questions or wants to get in touch. And we also just wanted to say thanks to our colleague Johan Humphreys from Swansea University for his support with the statistical analysis.
Thank you.
Thanks.